A man murdered his wife in 1983. Forensics said otherwise 40 years later. Jim is a 58-year-old man, presenting to a police interrogation room in 2023. He's confused, angry even. For 40 years, he thought he'd gotten away with it. In March of 1983, Jim's wife, 29-year-old Susan, was found dead in their suburban home in Ohio. The scene appeared straightforward to investigators at the time. Susan lay at the bottom of the basement stairs, her neck broken, surrounded by spilled laundry detergent and scattered clothes. Jim told police he'd been at work when it happened. He came home to find her like this. The local medical examiner ruled it an accidental death. Tragic fall down the stairs. Case closed. Jim collected the life insurance payout. He remarried 2 years later. Life went on. But Susan's sister never believed it. She knew her sister was cautious, knew those stairs well. Susan had talked about wanting a divorce just weeks before her death. But in 1983, without physical evidence contradicting the fall narrative, there was nothing she could do. Fast forward to 2022. The local police department receives a grant to re-examine cold cases using modern forensic techniques. Susan's case file ends up on Detective Rachel Morrison's desk. What she finds changes everything. See, in 1983, forensic science was relatively primitive by today's standards. DNA analysis as we know it didn't exist for criminal cases yet. The first use of DNA profiling in a criminal investigation wouldn't happen until 1986 in England. Touch DNA, the ability to extract DNA from skin cells left behind by touch, wasn't viable until the 2000s. But in 2022, Detective Morrison had tools that would seem like science fiction to investigators in 1983. And critically, she had evidence that had been properly stored. Among the preserved items, Susan's clothing from that day, a cotton blouse, blue jeans, and specifically, a cream-colored cardigan sweater she'd been wearing. Also preserved, fingernail clippings taken during the original autopsy, slides of tissue samples, and photographs. Lots of photographs that the original investigators took but apparently never examined closely enough. Detective Morrison starts with the photographs. Using modern image enhancement software, she zooms in on Susan's neck. There, barely visible in the original prints but clear as day with digital enhancement, are bruises. Not just any bruises. Oval-shaped contusions on both sides of the neck, approximately 2 centimeters in diameter, spaced in a pattern consistent with manual strangulation. Strangulation leaves specific forensic markers. When pressure is applied to the neck, it compresses the carotid arteries, from the Greek karatides, meaning to stupefy, because pressure here causes rapid loss of consciousness. The hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the anterior neck, often fractures during manual strangulation. Petechiae, from the Italian petechia, meaning flea bite, appear as tiny red spots in the eyes and face caused by ruptured capillaries from increased venous pressure. Detective Morrison pulls Susan's original autopsy report. The medical examiner in 1983 noted that the hyoid bone was intact, which seemed to rule out strangulation. But he never looked closely at the soft tissue of the neck. The focus was entirely on the fall trauma. Morrison sends the preserved tissue slides to the County Forensic Pathology Lab. Dr. Kenneth Chen, the chief medical examiner, reviews them under modern microscopy. What he finds is remarkable. In the soft tissue of Susan's neck, there's evidence of hemorrhaging in the strap muscles, the sternohyoid and sternothyroid muscles, showing injury consistent with compression. This type of injury pattern wasn't well documented in forensic literature until the 1990s. The 1983 examiner simply didn't know what to look for. But it gets more damning. Morrison authorizes DNA testing on Susan's clothing, specifically the cardigan sweater. Modern touch DNA analysis can recover genetic material from skin cells left behind when someone grabs or touches fabric. The process uses a technique called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. PCR, developed in the 1980s but not widely used in forensics until the 2000s, amplifies tiny amounts of DNA into quantities large enough to analyze. It works by repeatedly heating and cooling the DNA sample, causing the double helix to unzip and replicate. After 30-40 cycles, you can turn a few cells into millions of copies of DNA. The lab focuses on the neck area of the sweater, where the enhanced photos showed bruising on Susan's skin underneath. If someone strangled her, their DNA might still be there after 40 years. 3 weeks later, the results come back. Male DNA, not belonging to any of the 1983 investigators who handled the evidence. The lab runs it through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database, but gets no hits. The perpetrator isn't in the system. But Detective Morrison has a suspect. She obtains a search warrant for Jim's DNA. Here's where forensic genealogy enters the picture. Before directly testing Jim, Morrison works with a genetic genealogist. They upload the unknown male DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genetic database where people upload their DNA results to find relatives. The database returns several third and fourth cousins. Using traditional genealogical research, birth records, marriage certificates, census data, the genealogist builds family trees. They all point to one branch of one family, Jim's family. When police collect Jim's DNA via buccal swab and send it to the lab, the match is definitive. The DNA on Susan's cardigan is his. The probability of it being someone else, 1 in 780 billion. But defense attorneys could argue he lived with her. Of course, his DNA is on her clothes. Morrison needs more. She goes back to the evidence. The fingernail clippings. In 1983, they were taken as standard procedure but never analyzed. Susan's sister had mentioned Susan was a fighter. If she was attacked, she would have fought back. Using modern forensic techniques, the lab extracts microscopic tissue fragments from under Susan's fingernails. And there it is, epithelial cells containing male DNA. Jim's DNA. Epithelial cells, from the Greek epi, meaning upon, and theli, meaning nipple, referring to the tissue-covering surfaces, are skin cells. When Susan clawed at her attacker's hands as he strangled her, she literally took pieces of him with her. Those pieces stayed preserved under her nails for 40 years. The forensic picture becomes clear. Susan didn't fall down the stairs. She was strangled first, then staged to look like a fall. The actual trauma to her spine from the fall, documented by the original autopsy, occurred post-mortem or peri-mortem, creating superficial injuries that supported the fall narrative but weren't the cause of death. In April 2023, police arrest Jim at his home. In the interrogation room, he maintains his innocence. He says he loved Susan, says the DNA must be contaminated. But when Detective Morrison lays out the evidence, the DNA on the sweater, the skin cells under the nails, the enhanced photographs showing strangulation marks, the soft tissue hemorrhaging, his story begins to crack. Jim's attorney tries to challenge the DNA evidence, arguing that 40 years of storage could have degraded it, that contamination was possible. But forensic DNA analysts testify that the evidence was properly stored in a climate-controlled facility, that modern contamination protocols include testing for exactly these issues, and that the DNA profiles are complete and unambiguous. The trial lasts 3 weeks. Forensic experts explain to the jury how DNA works, how PCR amplification functions, how touch DNA can survive decades on fabric. A biomechanics expert testifies that the injuries to Susan's neck are inconsistent with a simple fall but consistent with manual strangulation followed by post-mortem positioning. During cross-examination, the defense tries to argue that the science is too new, too unreliable, but the prosecution brings in the statistics. DNA analysis has been accepted in U.S. courts since 1987. Touch DNA since the early 2000s. The techniques aren't experimental. They're established science used in thousands of convictions. In August 2023, the jury returns a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, Susan's sister, now 71 years old, addresses the court. She talks about 40 years of knowing her sister was murdered, but being unable to prove it. 40 years of watching Jim live freely, remarry, have children. She thanks the detectives and scientists who finally brought justice. Jim receives a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. At 58 years old, he'll die behind bars. But this case represents something bigger than one murderer finally facing justice. It represents the revolution in forensic science that's occurred over the past 40 years. In 1983, the tools didn't exist to solve Susan's murder. DNA profiling was 3 years away from its first criminal use. PCR was brand new laboratory science, not a forensic tool. Digital image enhancement, genetic genealogy, touch DNA analysis, none of it existed. But evidence properly collected and stored can wait. It can wait decades for science to catch up. And as techniques improve, as our understanding of biology and chemistry deepens, cases once considered unsolvable become solvable. The National Institute of Justice estimates there are approximately 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States. Many of these cases have preserved evidence sitting in storage, waiting for the next breakthrough in forensic science. Genetic genealogy alone has helped solve over 500 cold cases since 2018, including the Golden State Killer case. For Susan, justice took 40 years. But it came. Because someone preserved the evidence properly. Because detectives refused to let the case stay closed. Because scientists developed tools that seemed impossible in 1983. The intersection of time and technology has become the greatest threat to criminals who thought they escaped accountability. DNA doesn't forget. DNA doesn't degrade if properly stored. And every year, the tools to analyze it become more powerful, more sensitive, more revealing. For Jim, 40 years of freedom ended because Susan fought back, because her skin cells captured her killer's DNA under her nails, and because scientists 4 decades later had the tools to read that molecular evidence. The lesson isn't just about one solved case. It's about the long arc of justice, bent by the steady advancement of science. Evidence collected today with our current technology might seem thoroughly analyzed, but in 20, 30, 40 years, future scientists with tools we can't yet imagine might look at that same evidence and see what we missed. For anyone who thinks they got away with it, science is patient. Science doesn't sleep, and science is getting better every single day. Susan's grave in Ohio now has flowers that weren't there before. Her murder is no longer unsolved, and somewhere in an evidence locker right now, another 40-year-old case is waiting for the science that will crack it wide open. Thanks for watching. If you found this video educational, consider subscribing for more forensic science content. And remember, in the age of DNA, there's no such thing as the perfect crime, only crimes that haven't met the right technology yet.